Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy and welcome back to me talking about books, and today we are wrapping up the 2024 book recap. Last time we spoke about the worst books I've read in 2024, and today we're doing the opposite. Today I'm going to talk to you about the best books I've read in 2024, because of course I want to finish it up with some positivity. And without further ado, let's jump straight into it. First off, I would like to name just a few honorable mentions, and first of these honorable mentions are actually several comic books. Namely, I finally got into the Avatar comic book universe, and so far I've read 4 of them, and what can I say? They are a lot of fun. The Avatar: The Last Airbender series is one of my favorite series of all time, and this year, or well, 2024, 2024, I've been trying to get into all like the spin-off stuff. So I've read most of the Avatar novels, and I've also tried to read most of the comic books. And I'm slowly but steadily making my way through these, and I can tell you they are absolutely amazing. They pick up like not too long after the original show. I think just like 1 or 2 years after the original show has ended. And it gives a lot of answers to so many questions that like were still burning, and like burning questions we still had after finishing the show. For example, what happened to Zuko's mother? We get an answer to that in the comic books. What happens to Zuko as the new Fire Lord? Like what are his politics like? What are the politics of like trying to decolonize all those places the Fire Nation had taken over? How did society and technology progress between Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra? Because Legend of Korra is quite like heavily advanced in technology in comparison, and we see how all of those things develop in these comic books. And honestly, all of these have been a lot of fun so far. Some of them were a bit better than the others, but so far I've enjoyed every single one of them. And if you're a fan of the Avatar: Last Airbender show, I can definitely recommend the comic books to you. Another honorable mention in the non-fiction category is a book I've spoken about before on the channel, namely this one, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. Obviously, the war in Palestine is still ongoing, and I have to admit, when this became like world news, I had no idea about the conflict that was going on, like Palestine and Gaza. I knew next to nothing about the politics and the history of that region. And I decided to educate myself. I decided to do some research and wanted to read a book about the history of Palestine. And I eventually settled on reading this book. And this is a very comprehensive timeline, basically, of Palestine, its history, and mostly also its military conflicts that it's had since basically the late 19th century, early 20th century. And there were many, many interesting things in this book that I had never heard of. This book is very dense in terms of, giving you history facts, history numbers, years, dates, all that. It took me a while to get through this book, and you really do have to take breaks to sort of comprehend what you're actually reading. You might have to look up some stuff online or somewhere else while you're reading this book. But nevertheless, this was very, very educational, especially, like I said, as someone who had never really occupied himself with this topic before. I was really enlightened by many things that were talked about in this book. This is also written from the point of view of someone from Palestine who has Palestinian families and all that, who were involved in the conflict and all that. This is also, it's not the most recent one, so this doesn't talk about like the current issues that are going on, but it's quite recent. I think this is all the way up to like 2020 or something. So if, like me, you have an interest in actually finding out more about Palestine and its history and the military conflicts that are going on in that region, I can definitely recommend this book. And another quick shout out I want to give is to my favorite manga series, Requiem of the Rose King, because I finally managed to finish reading this series. So yeah, this was the final volume 17. I finally managed to finish this series. I know it's been finished for a while, but for some reason I hadn't really gotten around to finishing it. I finally did, and I loved it. I love the series. For those who don't know, Requiem of the Rose King is basically the story of Richard III based on the history plays by Shakespeare that tell the story of the Wars of the Roses. So it's mostly based on the Shakespeare plays, but also obviously ideas that the author themselves brought into this series, and also some more actual history facts all sort of thrown together here, telling a very, very interesting, very engaging story, sort of like Game of Thrones vibes as well, dark fantasy vibes, to great exploration of gender and masculinity as well, because Richard, the main character, Richard III, is intersex but identifies as male. So there's a lot of discussion there on gender issues in there. And I think this series managed to wrap up quite nicely in a way that I saw coming mostly, but still managed to surprise me at the end. And what I found out is that there's actually a spin-off going on as well. Like sort of, I think, a prequel spin-off to the series that I'm excited to get into as well. So yeah, just a quick shout out here to Requiem of the Rose King, because it's my favorite series and I finally managed to finish reading it. Okay, that's it for honorable mentions. Now we're jumping into actual best books that I have read this year. And we're starting it off with actually another manga, a manga I've spoken about on this channel before, namely Is Love the Answer? Is Love the Answer is a, you could say, coming of age drama manga about this young woman, Chika, and her realization that she might actually be Arrow Ace. Now, for those who don't know, I'm Ace myself, so I'm always on the lookout for Ace representation in the media, and I've never actually encountered asexuality in manga form. And I was so excited to see that this was at my local bookshop, because I'd only vaguely heard about it before, and then I saw obviously like Ace flags, Ace colors. I'm like, this is my manga, I have to read this. And this was honestly so cute, so sweet, so like just really heartwarming to read. So it's about this young woman who's finishing off high school and now starts like her career at university, new circle of friends, and around the same time she's slowly realizing things about herself, that she might not actually be into boys like her other girlfriends are, that she might not even be really into romance or like hand-holding or sex at all. So throughout this manga we see Chika realizing more and more things about herself. There's a lot of stuff where she does research. Some of the stuff is a little heavy-handed. There will be a lot of repetition for people who are already Ace or already familiar with all this stuff, you know. But I do appreciate that this actually shows a character doing research. We see Chika sitting down, actually Googling stuff, reading books about sexuality and gender. We get explanations of specific terminology. And while that is a bit much at times, while it sometimes felt a little bit like a reading a Wikipedia entry, I still appreciated it, because I think this is going to be good for people who are still trying to figure themselves out, or for people who are new to Ace discourse and just don't know everything yet. So I think in that regard that is quite interesting. And I also like that this manga manages to not only mostly talk about sexuality and romantic attraction, but also manages to actually sneak in a little gender talk as well, because we find out Chika is like, well, I'm mostly present femme, but I'm not sure if I fully identify 100% as a woman, so there's a little bit of that as well. And we find out that some of her new friends that she meets at university, some of them are less understanding of her identity, some of them are more understanding of her identity, and actually become sort of like a close circle of new queer friends that are all also trying to figure themselves out, especially in a society that might not as of yet be super accepting of queer people. So this was honestly such a comfortable read, easy to get through, quick to get through. You can read this in like one afternoon. And honestly, if like me, you are a manga or an anime fan, or are simply on the lookout for, you know, Ace rap, like good Ace rap, this is honestly one of the best representations I've seen in that regard in a long time. It really made me feel understood, like the author actually paid attention to all the details, made an effort to explain to people what asexuality is, what aromanticism might be, without hitting the reader over the head constantly with, you know, this is what you have to pay attention to, but it still manages to explain the terminology quite well without ever being too annoying, and I just feel like people like me who already have found their identity and then read this, you just feel understood and you're happy about the representation that you see. So I'm glad that I finally managed to read a manga that managed to do ace representation so well. Next up on the list of best books I've read in 2024, The Rise of Kyoshi. Yes, you thought we were done with Avatar: The Last Airbender content. No, of course not. As I mentioned, I've read the Avatar: The Last Airbender spin-off novels as well, and if you've seen my worst books of 2024 video, you know that I didn't like the Avatar Young Chen books all that much. But here we are now with the Kyoshi books, well, the first one at least, and I actually really, really liked this one. So I honestly didn't have that, like, my expectations weren't that high when I went into reading the spin-off novels, because I was like, okay, yes, I love this universe, I love the characters, but this is written by someone who wasn't a writer, at least I don't think so, on the show. It's not written by the original creators, and I was nervous that I might not actually like it, that it's like a bit too different, it's trying to do too many things too differently compared to the show. And while this novel is by no means perfect, this still surprised me in a positive way. Like, I think I ended up giving this a 4.25. Like, there were actually moments in this book that made me gasp. Like, there are one or two moments in this book where I was like, no, that did not just happen. And this rarely happens to me when I read books. So The Rise of Kyoshi tells the story of Kyoshi, the earthbending avatar as we know her from the show, and it tells a story of how she became the Avatar in the first place. And what I like about this book is that it does a bit of a twist on the Avatar reveal, because this isn't a spoiler. This is literally the opening of the book. The opening of the book is Kyoshi not being the Avatar. It's actually someone else. At least that's what people think. And Kyoshi actually works in the household of who people think is the Avatar, like a young man. And Kyoshi herself just thinks she's like a regular woman who's not even that good at earthbending. And then we get to see her day-to-day life, and it all builds up to this eventual reveal of her actually being the Avatar and not that boy that everyone else thought was the Avatar. So it's really great to see how this surprise like really hits Kyoshi and how she has to deal with it, how she suddenly has to become this like figure of authority, of spiritual leadership across the globe, and how she's completely thrown for a loop in her day-to-day life, and that she is suddenly thrown into a situation she didn't even anticipate, and then she has to like run away and has to like team up with people she never thought she would team up with, like on the other side of the law and all that. There's like a lovable gang of misfits she has to team up with, who are all criminals in their own way, and she sort of has to figure out how she can deal with this issue that she's been thrown into now that she is the Avatar. There's also a little bit of a romance going on that actually reveals Kyoshi to be bisexual, which I quite like. Like, she has a really sweet relationship with a female firebender in the book, which was really, really nice, which I liked reading because I know I'm famous for saying that I don't really like reading romance. The truth is, I do like reading romance if it doesn't take overhand, like, of the story, and if I like the characters that are involved in the relationship is written well. This is what happens in this book. Like, the relationship is part of the story, but it's not, like, it doesn't take over the entire plot. I like both women that are involved in the relationship, and it's a sweet and healthy relationship that I like reading about. So that was really nice. We get to see some cool bending action that we haven't even seen or heard of in the show. Even some surprises as to how some certain kinds of bending originated. So this was just a really entertaining novel, especially as a fan of the series. I was honestly surprised that this was so entertaining to read. And yes, I did also read the second novel like straight after that. The second Kyoshi novel, not as good as the first one, still quite entertaining though, but the first one honestly really positively surprised me. And if, like me, you are a fan of the show and were a little bit on the fence of if you want to read those spin-off books or not, definitely check out the Kyoshi novels, at least the first one. It's really great. We're getting into the top 3 of best books I've ever read. I'm going to cheat a bit with number 3, because number 3 is actually a series of comics, namely Hellblazer: Dead in America. So for those who don't know, John Constantine is my favorite comic book character of all time. I reviewed like Legends of Tomorrow, where he's a character. He also had his own show for a while, and Hellblazer is a very long-running comic book series that's been there since I think like I'm not quite sure now if I'm getting my numbers wrong, since the 80s, maybe even 70s. It's been like Hellblazer has existed for a very, very long time. And just a few years ago, there was a run by Simon Spurrier and some of his some other people whose name I don't remember now, and I absolutely loved his run of like Hellblazer comics that he made. Like, it was honestly some of the best Hellblazer I'd ever read, because it shows who Constantine is a character. You know, he's a bastard, working class, bisexual magic man who's doomed to never have a happy ending. And there's lots of political commentary and magic nonsense and over the top stuff that's also like a bit grimy and dark and like effed up in so many ways. And I thought Simon Spurrier's run was really, really good. And then I was hit with the news that in the beginning of 2024, he would get a new run. He would get to continue his run of the Hellblazer series, and that is Dead in America. I think as of right now, Dead in America is not quite finished yet, but almost. I think there's only one volume left, I think. So the story is basically done. Like, we're wrapping up to the finale. And honestly, I was so hyped to get into this. And honestly, this is peak Hellblazer. Obviously, as it is with every comic book run, some volumes are a bit better than others. But honestly, there was never an issue in this series so far that was like under 3.5 stars or something. There was no issue where I would say it was bad. There were some issues where I was like, it's a bit boring or like a bit too removed from the main story, but was still interesting. And honestly, like, some of the better issues in this are honestly so good, because they do not hold back with the political commentary. They do not hold back on showing who John is as a character. He is at times a heartless bastard, and that there's just some stuff at work in his life that he might not be able to stop, that he is not going to enjoy, stuff that is really gonna mess up his life and the life of everyone he's sort of friends with. I like that we get to see his relationship with his son in this series, which is quite interesting, because it's very complicated, very complex, because Constantine's not really dad material, not at all. And they're both not really fully aware of how their relationship works. So that is interesting to see. We have like a badass Scottish lady who's helping. We have the reappearance of Swamp Thing in a really cool sort of like desert cactus design, which I quite like. Sleep is in this as well. And I just think overall this run is really, really interesting. Now and then it gets a little sidetracked, which I didn't like as much, because, you know, the story is very much about, you know, John is dying and he's trying to figure out how he can stop that from happening, as you do. And he's involved with like Sleep, that he needs to get his sand back, you know, Sandman and all that. Swamp Thing gets involved with some other mysterious creatures that are trying to stop John, that are trying to help John. So sometimes it gets a little sidetracked, but honestly, I didn't mind that too much, because most of the side characters are still very interesting. There's a lot of political imagery and political commentary in this, which has always been the case for Hellblazer, at least good Hellblazer. And honestly, this doesn't hold back, especially since this is set in America. Because, I mean, John is usually like a character who's very much rooted in working class Britain, northern England. This is where he's from. And this time, this entire run is set in America, and this doesn't hold back on like commentating on like Republican versus Democratic politics, that there aren't really any good sides to anything anyway, like becoming famous in America, the American dream, all of that. There's so much interesting political commentary in this. Honestly, I would recommend this to people who live in the US. This is really, really interesting. Also, I think Hellblazer in general is not your typical kind of comic book. Like, it's not full of like those stereotypes, those cliches. I will admit it is different. It is grimy. It's dark. It does some weird stuff. but I think in a very, very interesting way. It's very mature, very grown up, and isn't afraid to like go there. Like it doesn't pull its punches. And I think if you're willing to like open up to reading a story about sort of like horror-esque magical realism with a heavy dose of political commentary, you're definitely gonna have fun with the Hellblazer comics, especially also with this run. And if, like me, you're a Hellblazer fan and maybe you haven't read this new series yet, definitely check it out. I think this is a great run for Constantine as a character, and I can't wait to see how this story will finish. We're at number 2 for the best books I've ever read, and we've actually got another non-fiction book. Number 2 for the best books I've read in 2024, we have this book, Refusing Compulsory Sexuality, a Black Asexual Lens on Our Sex-Obsessed Culture. Yes, I did manage to read quite a lot of ace-related literature in 2024, which was actually one of my goals. Shout out here first to this book, Ace by Angela Chen, which was sort of the first non-fiction ace book I read, which then led me to picking up this one, because I wanted to broaden my horizons and not only learn about my own sexuality a bit more, but also about perspectives I do not have by virtue of being a white man. And then I saw this book. And this book talks about asexuality and sexuality in general from the lens, mostly from the Black female or Black femme community. So 2 experiences I do not really have, and I have to admit I hadn't really thought of before. So I wanted to educate myself, and this book was really, really interesting. So this is divided into like several bigger chapters, which always have like sort of like subheadings. And what I appreciate is that every chapter and every subheading has a content warning, giving a warning as to what will be spoken about in the chapter, which I quite appreciated. And as you can see, I left tabs, which I normally don't really do that often. I even marked 3 entire chapters just because I thought that the entirety of them was so interesting. And similar to like the Palestine book I showed you, this just showed me so many things I hadn't even thought about before. Yes, of course, like I'm aware of like sort of the general struggles that ace people go through, given that I'm asexual and demi-romantic. So I sort of have that awareness, but I have a very different awareness of it, given that, you know, I live in the West, I live in Central Europe, I'm white, I'm a guy, so I have a different experience of things. So it was honestly really interesting to see this, you know, the ace discussion, or, you know, the issue of being ace sort of perceived from a different point of view. I don't have that. I've never considered before. And there are things in this that I had honestly never thought of before, where I was like, yeah, that does make sense that people who are Black or who are femme or both would experience being ace very differently, simply because there are very harmful stereotypes and cliches, like racist ideas, misogynistic ideas about certain types of people, plus them then being ace, which also carries its own like baggage of stereotypes and cliches. So reading about this, or like about several kinds of those issues, was really interesting, because I just felt like I was learning something about myself, about my community, about the ace community that I hadn't honestly ever thought about before. And honestly, I think if like me, you are involved or want to get a bit more involved in ace discourse or like queer discourse in general, this is honestly a really, really great book to read. It's not that long. It's like not even, it's like 200 pages. And it's written in a way where it doesn't talk down to you, uses a lot of like sources, or always quotes everything, gives you a list of like secondary reading and stuff that in an entire bibliography that you can look up for yourself. So it does feel very like academic to a certain degree, but never too like fanciful, never like it talks down to you, but like it's trying to educate you. Like it does explain certain phrases that you might already be aware of as an ace person, but also explains some terminology that maybe you haven't heard of before. So it didn't feel too repetitive, and it had excuse me, many aspects that I I hadn't even really looked into it. Like, for example, I really enjoyed the chapters that were about the history of being ace. Like, there are entire chapters that speak about, how being ace has basically, as with many identities in the LGBTQ plus community, have always been a thing. They were just known under different terms. They were known differently. Maybe they were seen as like an awkward state of mind. Maybe they were seen as a mentally ill state of mind at the time because people didn't understand it. So it was really interesting for me as a history nerd to read about that, to actually be like, oh, this is something that people were actually already aware of in the past. They just had different names for it. So honestly, there was so many different aspects to the experience of being ace and maybe also a romantic that were being talked about in this book that I really, really appreciate. Like, I really felt like I had learned something, like I was being set down for an interesting lesson about myself, about my community. And if, like me, again, if you're interested in ace discourse, or if you just want to learn about being ace, especially from a lens that not everyone always considers, definitely pick up this book. This was such a good read. And now, we're at number 1, the best book that I have read in 2024. And it is this one. Welcome to the Hyanamyong bookshop. So this book was a complete surprise to me. I had not heard of this book before. I think this is even the author's debut novel. I think this is also maybe even my first Korean novel. I'm not quite sure. I just happened to pick this up at the bookshop because I thought it looked cute and the premise sounded interesting. And I fell in love with this book. So this book, I'm gonna look at the synopsis because I don't remember all the main characters' names. So this book has the main character of Youngju, and she's I think at the start a young woman who experienced university, got married, and all that, had a respectable job, but then all of that changed. Like, her life fell apart. She was burned out, didn't enjoy her marriage anymore, and all that. And then, and this is then where the book sets in, she opens a bookshop. And we basically just get to read about Youngju's day-to-day life at her job. Like, we follow her, how she opens up this bookshop, looks for books that people want to read. How do you advertise? She builds in a little cafe that she wants because she thinks people might want to have some coffee while they read books. Then we read about the young man she hires for the coffee shop and what his life is like. And we get to meet all the different people that come to her bookshop that are maybe customers, maybe they're even friends or family members. And we get to read about a handful of characters and their lives and their experiences that are related to the bookshop. Naturally, it's mainly about Youngju, about the main character, her experiences, her job. But we also read a lot about the young man that she hires to become a barista at the little cafe she has in a bookshop. We read about like a mom and her young son who come to the bookshop because the son doesn't really enjoy reading, but is supposed to learn how to read books, how to get into reading. We read about like events that happen at the bookshop, because the main character organizes, book talks. There's like a book club, and we see how she prepares for those, that she prepares questions and discussions, and that sometimes she organizes even author talks. And then we read about how she prepares for like author interviews, and then we get to read actual excerpts from the author interviews, like question answer. We get to read about, some blog entries that she writes, or that other people write about the bookshop, or the events that happen there. And so, as you might be able to guess from how I'm telling you about this book, is this doesn't really have a set plot. This isn't really like a book you pick up and then it's like, this is what the story is about, this is the goal, this is where we're going, this is the point. This book doesn't really do that. And normally it's really rare for me to enjoy books that sort of don't really have a set goal, because I usually have a tendency to enjoy books a bit more that like have a clear like red thread where I know, okay, this is where we are, this is where we're going, this is the goal of the story. But with this book, I didn't actually mind that much that this wasn't the case, because I simply enjoyed hanging out with the characters at the bookshop. This really does feel like it's a book for people who love books. So you really get involved in, talking about how people write book reviews, how people interview authors, how book clubs happen, how a bookshop is being maintained, how you might have to like review books that you don't really enjoy, how you have to organize something for entertainment for the customers, even though you might not even really be involved, or how you start a business and it's not even really going that well, but you really, really want to do it, and you want to get people excited about books. Like, how do you manage to do that? Like, what kind of management do you put in place in order to like really get people to visit bookshops again and to get people interested in reading? It just really felt like I was in my like this was my world as someone who enjoys reading books so much, who enjoys going to the bookshop, who likes to go to bookshop cafes, who's been to, book discussions. Like it's about people like us who just really, really enjoy books, who really enjoy reading and everything that has to do with it. And not only does this book manage to like talk about all like those different aspects of the literary world and all that, but also manages to put in some, social critiques and political commentary as well, because this also talks about things that might even be considered taboo, especially in South Korea. How it talks about it, the main character had this, seemingly perfect life. That she went to university, she got married young, then she had a good job, but then she was burned out. She got burned out. She didn't enjoy her job anymore. She was overworking herself, and she didn't enjoy the marriage she was in. Wasn't in love with her husband anymore. And then she gets a divorce, becomes single again, opens up her own business, and it talks about that how working mentality is different, how people sometimes work themselves to death for a company that doesn't even really care about them. So it speaks about stuff like that, especially also from the perspective of a female character, because gender roles are still a bit stereotypical, especially also in countries like South Korea. And it was interesting to read about those perceptions in a different country, in an Eastern country like South Korea, to see what kind of issues are maybe even still considered sort of taboo to talk about, especially also for women or for young people. Because, for example, like the young man who starts working at the bookshop as a barista, like we also learn about his life that he's actually quite young and that he did study, but doesn't really feel like he wants to have this typical life. That he doesn't want to, go out, get the highest degree, find a really cool IT or medical job that his parents want for him. But no, that he goes into this cafe, in this bookshop, and is like, I would like to work at your cafe for a minimum wage, and then he's sort of happy with that. And he learns to be accepting of that. He actually enjoys this kind of life, that he doesn't have to live up to these expectations that society or his parents might have of him. This I just really enjoyed getting to know these characters. Sometimes some of the characters are maybe unnecessary. You could argue like the cast of characters becomes a bit big at times, but if you focus on like especially the two main characters, the two people who work at the bookshop, and then their one or two friends are really close to, that set of characters is really interesting to read about. And this never gets like super dramatic. This never becomes a super thrilling story that keeps you like on the edge of your seat because you want to know what happens next. No, it's not that kind of book. It's just a book with really good vibes, basically. Like, it's mostly just vibes, but the vibes are excellent. And for once, I didn't mind that. I usually really have troubles with books like this that are mostly like sort of like, no, we're not really doing like a story, not a plot, but we're sort of just like hanging around with a bunch of characters, trying to talk about some issues, but we're not trying to get to like an actual, goal as in this is what the character wants to achieve. The book is not really doing that, and I didn't mind that because every time I picked up this book, I felt like this is gonna sound cliche, but it felt like a warm hug. I just felt like this book was a really nice read. I just felt comforted, and it's been a really long time that I picked up a book, or like at least a new book, where I just felt comfortable like reading it, where I was really like looking forward to getting back into it because I just felt really warm inside, because this book just made me feel yeah, like comfortable, and like I was in a safe area with safe people that I liked reading about, who talk about things that I'm also interested in, and who do so in a very mostly like thoughtful and accepting manner. And yes, maybe you could argue that this is a little bit boring at times, a little bit pointless at times, maybe. Sure, you could argue that, or that some people think some of the stuff is a bit redundant, or a bit too preachy, or a bit too cheesy. Sure, I could see people say that, but honestly, this made me feel just good. Like, reading this book just made me feel good inside. Like, I honestly really enjoyed reading this so much that this was like the only book that was close to being like a 5-star read for me this year. Like, 5-star reads are very rare for me, and this book was like the only one that really came close to that in 2024, simply because I finished this book, and even though I wasn't like, oh, like celebrating this book, but when I finished it, I was just feeling like I completed a really comfortable experience that made me feel seen, that made me feel warm inside, that made me feel like I didn't waste my time. I actually felt like I spent good, valuable time. Like, it was time well spent reading this book and getting to know who these characters are, that are very realistic, that are people who you could meet in your real life and that you would want to talk to. And it's all combined with a community, the book community, that I'm part of, that I like, because I like books, I like reading, and I like reading about these experiences that have to do with books and reading. So honestly, I can recommend this to anyone who just needs a warm hug, but as a book, and loves to like just have a book about reading. Just a book that makes you feel seen as a reader. It shows you the love for reading, it shows you the love for the book community, for the review community, and that isn't too exciting in terms of like trying to like thrill you, to excite you, but still manages to like draw you in, to talk about the lives of these ordinary but interesting people, and still manages to even point out some, social and political mishaps that need to be discussed. So yeah, this was my favorite book of 2024, and given that it was I think a debut novel by the author, like, kudos to this person. And I'm really looking forward to maybe reading some other stuff by this author. And this book also made me interested in like getting to get into reading more Korean fiction, because this just made me feel good things. And I hope if you do decide to pick this up as well, that it makes you feel just as comfortable as well. So that's it for my best books I read in 2024. What are some of your favorite books that you have read in 2024? Do tell me down in the comments below what your favorite reads were of 2024. If you read any of the books that I've presented to you here today, tell me about it down in the comments below. As you know, I always love to hear your thoughts and opinions on stuff I read, or on stuff that you have read that maybe I haven't heard about. As you know, I'm always curious to see what all of you guys are reading. As always, if you're curious as to know what I'm currently reading, if you want to stay up to date with my reading journey or my reviews, do follow me on Goodreads or on Storygraph. Links for those programs are in the description down below. I try to update regularly and write reviews for every book I read, so make sure you follow me on there. So that's it for today. In case you want to know what my worst reads of 2024, make sure you check out last week's video. I will link it up here and down there in case you're curious. So go and watch that if you haven't done that yet. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.